Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. It is our latest post-game edition. 9 matchups now in the books for the 2022 season. Nittany Lions 7-2 after a 45-14 win in Bloomington, Indiana, which is where Daniel Gallen joins us from at Memorial Stadium, finishing up his post-game coverage for Lions247.com. And Daniel, always good to catch up with you when you're on the road for these games. I'm here at headquarters in Happy Valley, and we wanted to see a Penn State team that came back with an attitude, that came back with confidence, that came with a purpose to play for something in November. We wanted to see a Penn State team that showed signs of that youth movement, taking charge, carrying them through the remainder of this season into 2023. Got about as good of a blend of both those goals as you were going to achieve over the course of this matchup.
We definitely did today. We saw a lot of different players, some of them in roles we hadn't seen them in before, and we saw a lot of those players playing well. You look at what happened on the offensive line, which I'm sure we're going to get to. The defense showed up in a big way after being, we'd been looking for something from that pass rush. I know Mark Brennan was happy with what he saw based on his bold prediction. But Penn State needed to come out and show that they could rebound again. Sean Clifford said that they were pretty pissed off, that's his words, about how that game last week went. They approached practice with that kind of attitude, and they came out from Bloomington, a place the last time they were here, things didn't go so well. They came out of this place that has, has been a tough place to play at times. They came out with a very resounding victory.
I remember the trip they made out there in 2018 after they had lost a couple tough Big Ten matchups against better opponents in the conference, and it was one that went down to the wire. Some weird things happened. The wind was gusting. I was thinking about it leading up to kickoff. Would it be a similar matchup here in that game as well? Indiana used multiple quarterbacks. One had more luck than the other. You were kind of keeping an eye on could Indiana have some things go their way, swing momentum. They haven't had much of that. They had a great drive out of Jack Tuttle, who started this game with his transfer out of the program looming in the postseason. It's just a bizarre set of circumstances, but he was the guy they tabbed as QB2 in this matchup to step up to the QB1 role with their starter not available. By the end of this thing, though, Daniel, Tuttle gets a great touchdown drive he puts together, his legs, his arms. It's a 7-7 game. He ends up exiting. We see 3 different quarterbacks play for Indiana. Collectively, they fall short of 200 total yards to the Hoosiers against Penn State. They average about 3 yards per play. The Nittany Lions set a program record with 16 tackles for loss. They get 6 sacks. And oh, by the way, they put together almost 500 total yards of offense, with freshmen accounting for 6 of those touchdowns. So I'm not sure where you want to start, but let's begin here. Penn State answered the bell yet again when they had to pick themselves up off the mat after a very, very difficult loss last week.
Bryce Effner offered a little bit of insight into that during his post-game availability today. He said during the week at practice that James Franklin didn't play any music for the Nittany Lions. We're there sometimes, and there's lots of music, keeps the energy up, keeps things going. But Effner said it wasn't there this week. James Franklin wanted Penn State to create its own energy. I think that if you saw photos or were watching on TV, you saw that it was not the biggest crowd in Bloomington today. I think the weather kept a lot of people away. A bad Indiana season kept a lot of people away. So it was going to be really on Penn State to manufacture that energy. There wasn't going to be the big house to feed off of. There wasn't going to be Jordan-Hare Stadium to feed off of. And I think that Penn State was trying to avoid a flat performance. And the first quarter was once again a little touch and go at times, but they really did that. They didn't let this one loss snowball into 2. There's, as of right now, there's no spiral. I think that it's a good thing to see given how these past 2 games have gone, or the past 2 years have gone, that Penn State was able to get a win after a loss, and they're at 7 wins now with 3 to go. They won 7 games all of last year. They won 4 games all of 2020. So I think that they continue to put themselves in a good spot, and I think that they're continuing that drive for 10 wins and a New Year's Six bowl berth.
And they looked like a motivated bunch, didn't they? I mean, that was a huge question we had going into this month because of what modern college football is and what it means when you lose two games in a season. And when you get eliminated from your conference title contention, you wonder what is going to surface. And what we saw was a team that put together one of its most complete efforts against clearly one of the worst teams on their schedule this year. We can reassess it after 13 matchups of the year, but this Indiana squad coming in just about as advertised going out. I mean, this is a team that really at a crossroads right now. 1-14, I believe, in their last 15 Big Ten matchups since that 2020 season where they went 6-2. So they've got a lot of questions to answer in Bloomington, and this matchup is not going to help. But Penn State control the controllables. You know, you can only play who you play. They did not play down, and there was a moment in this matchup where Indiana made it a 7-7 game. They got some gutsy play out of that quarterback, Jack Tuttle, for a moment, and they had the early interception off Sean Clifford. And I thought that a big kind of thing to come out of it was that's all really Indiana had. And you kind of had a sense, would Indiana have multiple counter punches in this game, or would they really just have one chance to try to capture some energy and keep it going? I thought the response in the second quarter from Sean Clifford in the passing attack, but really collectively the defense, the way they just shut down Indiana, and really the way they got the ground game going, that by the time they got to halftime, you realize something colossally bad was going to have to take place for Penn State to be put on upset alert.
The Penn State defense's response to that interception was really big. Sudden change has been a topic of conversation, especially after how last week went in the fourth quarter with some of the breaches that the Penn State defense had when the offense gave the ball back to Ohio State. But after that interception, Indiana has 1st and 10 at the 31. You're thinking they're probably going to get at least 3 here based on this field position. A couple of plays later, it's 4th and 34, and they're punting. The Penn State defense was really able to be disruptive. I think that the way that Indiana played offense really kind of lent itself to what Penn State is good at as a defense in terms of trying to stretch things out horizontally a lot. I mean, those screen passes on the edge for the second straight week just were not going anywhere. There's really nothing doing for Sean Shivers, the running back, and a couple of those wide receivers. So I think that benefited Penn State a lot. But that response was really good. And then the response to that touchdown drive where, I mean, suddenly, they force a 3-and-out on the first drive. Suddenly it's, let me see. Yes, 8-play, 75-yard drive. It looked easy. And then from then on out, I mean, you look at the Indiana drive chart, there's the touchdown, then the interception. So they forced the punt on the 4th and 34, and then there are 4 straight 3-and-outs before Indiana kneeled things out to end the half. I mean, I talked about it on our preview podcast where there is going to be the chance to get off the field quickly and give the offense lots of opportunities. And when Penn State had the opportunity to get Indiana off the field, they really did. I mean, you look at the drive chart, you look at that time of possession. I mean, it was pretty brutal at times, and the Penn State defense was really able to suffocate Indiana. And the offense, it was complimentary football today.
Yeah, the Indiana Hoosiers drive chart is something. It's 7 3-and-outs in there. You got 3 interceptions involved. Their longest possession of this game was just a bit over 3 minutes. Unfortunately for them, that came when they were down 45-7 already. That 3-minute possession for them. So. A lot to love about the way this Penn State defense handled this business against clearly an overmatched Indiana squad that doesn't have the right quarterback for them right now. They're still trying to sort through what they're going to do moving forward. I'd imagine Tuttle injured along the way, not available to go. They bring in a true freshman, yank him pretty fast after an interception. And then we see more of a dynamic presence, a guy that we were kind of told ahead of this matchup. Keep an eye for Dexter Williams. He gets in the game. He can maybe do some things with his legs. 4 of 11, 41 yards. He threw 2 interceptions. Both of those interceptions led quickly to Penn State touchdowns. We'll talk about who threw those touchdown passes in a little bit. But let's start with QB1 because that was such a topic of conversation leading up to kickoff. It felt like every single one of our podcasts this week at least a significant segment was dedicated to that topic of conversation because of the way James Franklin left the door open this week. Well, here we are. Sean Clifford, the stat line isn't all that impressive. 15 of 23, 229 yards, one interception. Drew Aller came in late. We'll talk about what he did. But Sean Clifford feeds into that early fuel for Indiana. They score the touchdown the very first play on the ensuing Penn State drive with the score at 7-7. Poor decision, poorly thrown, whatever you want to phrase it. It was poor. It ends up it intended for Brendan Strange. It ends up in the hands of an Indiana defender, and all of a sudden you're giving that short field to work with. As we discussed, the Nittany Lions turned that into a 4th and 35, and they avoided any issues out of that. But you're thinking, wow, this is exactly what you don't want if you're Sean Clifford, who has to know what the circumstances are and has to know the staff wants to get a look at Drew Aller. But my thought was, what's the team around him thinking? What are those guys on the sideline thinking? What's the defense thinking? What's the offense? What are the other offensive players? What's going through their head? And I just wondered, are we going to see this team sag their way through the first half here? They bounced out of it, but an early moment there, and it's been dicey in the first quarters for Sean Clifford. 4 interceptions in the first quarter now over the last 3 games. No touchdown throws along that way. James Franklin said it a couple times in his post-game press conference. They got to take that kind of a play away. But 3 games left of the eligibility. You're going to get what you get with Mr. Clifford. And you saw that early, and I'm sure a lot of people were groaning collectively across Nittany Lions Nation. It ends up with a 31-point victory. But I know people weren't necessarily thrilled with what they saw from the quarterback position for much of this matchup, though they did get a lot in the ground.
You were kind of worried that you were going to see more of the fourth quarter from the Ohio State game kind of carry over into this one. And I think that that's kind of the worry when you have such a demoralizing loss like that, when you're playing in this type of environment, in this type of conditions. And when Clifford throws that interception, I mean, it's in the back of your mind, like that this could go off the swivel pretty quickly, but it didn't. And I think a big part of that was the running game. We've said it over and over again, but Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton have just added a completely different dimension to this offense. Like if Penn State is playing this game a year ago, Sean Clifford doesn't have that running game to lean on. He has to do all of it, and who knows what happens in that type of situation. I know that when you saw the weather forecast, when you know what Penn State is coming off of, when you know how Clifford has played this year, 2021 Illinois 9 overtimes started to creep into people's minds a little bit, but Clifford didn't do that, and I thought it was a pretty standard Clifford experience. You had the nice throws. He hit Theo Johnson up the seam. Later, he had Johnson open for what would have been a touchdown, but Johnson dropped it. I thought the 45-yard catch and run to Kaytron Allen was a really nice play by Clifford, where he's using his legs, but he's still looking to throw the ball in that situation, and he let Kaytron Allen really do a lot of the work there. But then on top of it, you have the throw that ends up in the interception. He hung Theo Johnson out on a similar throw up the seam where Johnson took a big hit that was late. It was just kind of like what you said. I mean, there's 3 games left in this eligibility plus a bowl game. Those plays that James Franklin talks about that, we need to get rid of. I think at this point you have to live with them because this is who that quarterback is. There's a 42 start sample size. But overall, I mean, I thought it was a pretty typical Clifford start. You had some pretty good highs. There are some times that left things to be desired. But I think the running game really picked things up because there were never really any lulls in how this offense played.
They did a nice job avoiding precarious third down situations in this game. And in some moments where they did need to go downfield on third down, Clifford was able to connect with his guy, Mitchell Tinsley. I know Parker Washington has the bigger numbers over the course of the season, but it feels like on a lot of these third down moments, Mitchell Tinsley has been the go-to target all the way back to the initial possession of the season at Purdue. By the way, Parker Washington didn't duplicate his performance from last week, 4 catches, 30 yards. But it had a big 19-yard punt return. And also Tinsley, 5 catches, 63 yards. But what he did early in this game helping Penn State put some points on the board, letting them move the ball, gain some confidence. I thought really impressive performance from him early on in the matchup. Theo Johnson, 4 catches, 43 yards. He scored a touchdown at the end, catching the ball from Drew Aller. He should have had a couple touchdowns. He should have been pushing up over 60, 70 yards with that touchdown. But as you said, he dropped the ball. With Sean Clifford, he's down to those 3 starts now. Something that was interesting coming out of this matchup when James Franklin elects to keep him on the sideline as that lead swells up to 4 possessions or whatever it was. Sean Clifford is now fewer than 20 passing yards away from setting the all-time record in Penn State history. Trace McSorley is the guy who holds on to that record right now. You'd imagine that record will fall in the first quarter in Beaver Stadium against Maryland next Saturday. And James Franklin certainly sets it up for us to ask far less about who's starting this upcoming Saturday back home in Beaver Stadium with that record so close within reach. And additionally, Franklin really did his best to distance himself, I felt like, from a lot of the open-ended nature of the conversation. And he certainly downplayed the dialogue, at least, about what took place leading up to kickoff and why QB1 remained unchanged.
Yeah, his quote after the game when he was asked about this is he said that nothing had changed. Everybody still saw it the same way that he did. He wanted to make sure that he wasn't too close to the decision. And when he was pressed on kind of what he meant by that in terms of being too close to the decision, he said that he just wanted to make sure everyone saw it the same way that he did. So, he threw it out there that, the last time he talked, he got 7 straight questions about the quarterback, and was kind of wondering why that was, even though he kind of left a lot of room for interpretation this week. But yeah, I think that it's clear that Sean Clifford will continue to be the starter moving forward. They did get Drew Aller a lot of reps today. He played essentially, a quarter and a half, which is a little bit more than he's played in a while. But it was interesting post game in terms of kind of the, things were left open-ended this week. There was never that firm Sean Clifford is going to be starting. James Franklin was given the opportunity to say that. He didn't take it. So, we were looking, all warm-ups. Is Sean Clifford taking the snaps from Juice Scruggs? Is he the first one out? Is his helmet on the sideline? Are we going to see Drew Aller in the second quarter? It was a lot of, things were a little touch and go. It felt like at times, but that was at least externally. It sounds like internally there was none of that Clifford was the guy, and that, what James Franklin was saying publicly maybe didn't necessarily reflect kind of the feeling in the building and what their game plan was coming into this weekend.
Today, Drew Aller sets career highs for completions with 9 of them, pass attempts with 12, 2 touchdowns. That matches his performance in week 2 back against Ohio when he threw for 88 yards. Today, he threw for 75 yards. On the season now, Aller at 4 touchdown passes, no turnovers, and James Franklin did make it a point, a guy they want to keep working in, getting those reps to, and certainly getting that bond built with some of these other freshmen who are doing big things on the field as you try to work on this upswell of young talent on the Penn State roster. Again, the quarterback conversation will carry into another week, but where it is right now, you have to check every week. Sean Clifford now a little bit more secure, certainly, than we thought he might be 48 hours ago, even 24 hours ago. And he's coming down to the wire here. 2 home games left before he wraps things up in a Penn State uniform. Let's get to that ground game and the offensive line. Before we talk about what Katron Allen did today, which was sensational, and Nick Singleton scored as well, the offensive line, if there was a chaotic element to what was happening behind closed doors and team facilities this week, perhaps it wasn't the quarterback conversation. Perhaps it was trying to find the right 5, 6, 7 guys to get through this game on the offensive front. Olu Fashanu did not make this trip. You did not spot him coming off those buses in Bloomington. Caden Wallace was out there. However, it was Bryce Effner again at right tackle. Salim Wormley was available, although James Franklin acknowledged that he's been dealing with some things. He works through some things. He says the same goes for left guard Hunter Norzad. And then, by the way, you continued to be without Lennon Tengwall, who missed his 4th consecutive game in the left guard position. What that left you with was a pretty thin situation, and what we saw on the first Penn State possession, Daniel, was Hunter Norzad heading to the sideline with an issue, and you thought, wow, this is getting dicey in a hurry.
Penn State traveled 2 walk-on freshmen today in Jim Fitzgerald, who's a 6'7" offensive tackle, and Ian Harvey, who's an interior offensive lineman. And when you looked at the group that was going through warm-ups, and you saw Fitzgerald and Harvey, going through where you would normally see, the depth scholarship guys. I mean, it is very, very thin. Those guys were kind of a heartbeat away in certain ways. But I think the biggest compliment you can give this offensive line and how they performed is that you didn't really notice them that often. I think there was one stunt when Clifford got sacked and took a pretty big hit. That jumped out to you as a lapse up front. Drew Shelton got called for a penalty at one point, and that was the only time you heard his name called. I think that the offensive line really did a good job by being anonymous today. I think that was really, really big for them and really helped them. I mean, you saw a lot of JB Nelson, who rotated in with Landon Tangwall in that Central Michigan game, but hadn't really been seen or heard from since outside of special teams and the end of some blowouts. Obviously, this was our first long look at Drew Shelton. This was our first long look at Hunter Norzad at right guard. It was, a lot of different pieces, a lot of different moving parts. If you think back to what the week 1 starting lineup was at Purdue, at one point later in the game, Drew Scruggs is the only one who was left from that group after when Sal Wormley got a little banged up, if I'm remembering that correctly. So there was a lot of moving parts. I thought they acquitted themselves well. I think it helps when you're blocking for running backs like Katron Allen and like Nick Singleton, but that offensive line will be really interesting to watch. James Franklin said post-game that the goal was to redshirt Drew Shelton, and the goal was also to redshirt JB Nelson this year. But given what the health of Olu Fashanu, Landon Tangwall, Caden Wallace, and now Salim Wormley, and then you extend that to some of the depth scholarship guys that we've barely seen at all this year. It's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out down the stretch.
Want to get another look at this game on the rewatch, but I thought upon first glance, Drew Shelton certainly didn't look like he was stepping into a situation that was too big for him. And that goes back to what James Franklin told us after practice on Friday, where they do feel like if they had needed him at this point, they would have been comfortable burning his red shirt at this, and when we discussed, well, it just so happens that the starting left tackle may be the best left tackle in America. But we don't know if that left tackle in Olu Fashanu is going to be able to come back next week or the week after. And you start to think about the money that may be on the table for him, despite only having these 9 career starts. And you start to do the math and wonder what Olu Fashanu's status is with this team moving forward. And if he's healthy, I know he'll play. But we may see Drew Shelton pick up the kind of experience that maybe they wanted to get Olu last year and they couldn't because he was banged up and he wasn't available for them. And he didn't really get that until the bowl preparation and the Outback Bowl. You could see an accelerated process where Drew Shelton is your left tackle here, at least for a duration in November. And then he's pretty well suited to go into next offseason if Olu Fashanu takes advantage of this NFL opportunity to be in a much better spot than you can imagine a second-year offensive tackle in the Big Ten. So this could have been a key step forward in a big November for Shelton. And I thought working your way inside, there was a moment they gave up their only sack of this game where there's some confusion on the interior. JB Nelson, Drew Scruggs, you saw a rusher get in between those guys on touch, and you're thinking, oh no, is this going to turn into a situation where miscommunication? We saw that a lot last year, if you remember, where it just felt like guys were not on the same page. And they were able to really, despite moving this way, that way, guys on the sideline, the guy doesn't play much. When you have 2 running backs average almost 5 yards per carry, you only give up 1 sack. And oh, by the way, it's 13 sacks now surrendered in 9 games on the season after giving up 34 sacks in 13 contests last year. I got to tip my cap to Phil Troutwine for what they were able to do under duress this week and kind of got to showcase some of their development with some of these players that they've brought into the program more recently. You want to see more of this in November, but you come out of this matchup, and I think it's another check in the positive box of forward progress for a unit that, outside of this young quarterback they have, may hold as much to the key of potentially going to the college football playoff someday as any place on this roster.
If we were sitting, if I was doing the post-game pod at Purdue in week 1, and you told me what this offensive line was going to look like in week 10 at Indiana, I would have been like, oh, Penn State's in big trouble. They're fighting to get bowl eligible right now. Things haven't gone well, but they've really been able to weather these injuries without any real issues. I think that some of that goes to the supporting cast. I mean, Sean Clifford, for his part, I think that he is good at least avoiding sacks in the pocket. What he does when he's off his spot, sometimes that can leave something to be desired. But for the most part this year, it feels like he's doing a good job at least navigating things, staying out of really bad trouble. And then Drew Aller also did the same thing too, where he's able to move well in the pocket. And you couple that with guys like Kaytron Allen, like Nick Singleton, where Bryce Effner was talking about it after the game. Like with Kaytron Allen, when he's behind them, I think he worded it like the offensive line, you have to play like your butt's on fire, where you just fire off the line, get to your man, and that even if you give Kaytron Allen the slightest hole, he's going to be able to see it, and he's going to be able to get through it, and he can make something happen. So I think that there's a lot of factors that, outside of the offensive line that go into kind of relieving the pressure on them and everything. But when you look at how this offensive line played today, I mean, I think that it's just a very solid group. I think that you can kind of see the work that Phil Troutwine is doing. Offensive line is really hard to evaluate from our perspective, just because of how intricate it can be. But he's pushing a bunch of different buttons, and it all worked today. Who's to say how it would have looked if it was Ohio State or Michigan and not this Indiana team? But there are some, a couple good pass rushers. I like Deshaun McCullough as a player a lot. Alfred Bryant looked good in getting around the line and getting that sack on Clifford. But I think that you can look at today as a big step forward for the offensive line in terms of who played and how they played, and and what that means for these guys, for Phil Troutwine, for this offense.
Last year, not only was that offensive line not effective and disappointment, but it wasn't deep either. It wasn't like you could say like, okay, well, you're trying a bunch of different parts. There was like, okay, you're only willing to try 6 guys, maybe 7 guys, and this is still what you're getting. This year, it's improved, and we've seen 8, 9, 10 guys at this point. When you kind of go off the last month of guys who have played extended, back-to-back possessions, quarters, halves, full games. And that is a really good thing to see from this group. So we'll see if it carries forward. I do want to give also a quick note, the blocking from Brenton Strange, the tight end room, Theo Johnson as well. But Brenton Strange, the last 4 games combined, he's under 60 combined receiving yards. That's pretty startling considering how this season started for him. But he has not stopped being a top-level blocker at this tight end position. So I got to say, I've learned a lot about Brenton Strange over the course of this year, whether or not the ball's in his hand. And he had a highlight reel grab on a ball that went through a defender's helmet today, which was another great moment for him as a receiver. But it really hasn't been about getting the ball in Brenton Strange's hand game in, game out, because he just seems like he's a gamer. And he's really taken a big step for them at tight end this year. I have a lot of respect for how his career has gone here in year 4. But let's get to those freshman running backs, because it feels like if Penn State's going to really hit it out of the park here in the next few games and enter this offseason on a high note, people across the country are going to be talking about this backfield tandem of Nick Singleton, Kaytron Allen. Kaytron Allen was the star of the group. He was arguably the MVP of this team today. I think you can make a very strong case there. 72 yards receiving, 86 yards on the ground today. He's going up 20 touches, turning those into about 160 yards, 3 touchdowns. Nick Singleton, meanwhile, turned 16 carries into 73 yards on the day. It wasn't a case where Singleton had 30 yards on one carry and then did a bunch of the other work with 2-3 yard gains. 15 was his long. So 4.6 average for Singleton, 4.8 average for Kaytron Allen. And on the same day, Daniel, they tie the freshman rushing touchdown record, which belongs to Noah Cain. He had 8 of those in 2019, but now he moves aside a little bit, has room for Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton. And we'll see where it ends up after the year, but those guys will spend the next 4 games trying to figure out who lands on the top of that list coming out. Really just really impressive stuff. And I can't say enough about Kaytron Allen in particular, a guy that I think looks as complete and patient and willing to let that cutback set up on its own and then exploit it as any true freshman I can recall in recent memory.
Jalen Sider talked about Kaytron Allen's ability to still be powerful, even though he's dropped a lot of weight since he's gotten to Penn State. And I think that was very clear on the 1 touchdown run where he just runs through that safety. I mean, that safety came up, met him at the line of scrimmage, and just fell down. Kaytron Allen, it's just like the way that he plays, even though he's running over guys, it's still almost graceful in terms of how he's able to hit the cutback, accelerate. He's just such an easy player, which I think that coming in, I think we were maybe thinking more of like the Kevon Lee type, where it's, kind of, and even closer to how Nick Singleton runs in terms of that power, where the exertion is so obvious in terms of inviting contact. But Kaytron Allen doesn't really play like that. But he just came up with a lot of big plays today when the ball was in his hands. There was that 38-yard touchdown drive for Penn State's second touchdown, where Kaytron Allen took the ball 27 yards and then came back with an 11-yard touchdown run. He just, he seemed very in control. He seemed like he knew where he wanted to go every time he had the ball. And he just remains so assertive. I mean, you never see him get stacked up at the line, or if someone does get to him at the line of scrimmage or behind the line, he's able to make them miss or get off of them, or at least push back to the line of scrimmage for 1 yard, 2 yards, 3 yards. That was something that Jalen Sider mentioned with Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton, that these are guys that are turning 1 yards into 5 yards, 6 yards into 8 yards, 4 yards into 6 yards, that there's always something extra after that first contact. And I think that we've really seen that from Nick Singleton over these past couple of games. And you mentioned it, 4.6 yards per carry. I think that we're starting to see that yards per carry number come down a little bit for him, but that's not a product of, him really getting bottled up or him, being worse, for lack of a better term. I think that it's because he is running in between the tackles. He's kind of learned at this point that he's not just going to take the ball every time, get to the edge and go, that you can't do that in college. I think that this is really an example of his growth, and he's willing for such an explosive and fast runner. I mean, he puts his head down, he gets through that line, he bursts through the hole. I was convinced that he had a 70 or an 80-yarder in him today, just with how quickly he was getting to that second level. Indiana had a couple shoestring tackles, I think, where they were really able to get him down. But I think for the one Kaytron Allen play that stands out is that 45-yard catch and run that he had. He did a pretty good job setting up his blocks, getting all the way back across the field, but it got to the point where there was one guy there, that guy was going to get him. It was pretty clear at that point. And instead of going out of bounds or maybe trying to cut back to the middle one more time, Kaytron Allen just looks up and just lowers the shoulder right into him. I think that attitude is something that you want to see from the running backs. It's not necessarily something that we've seen from the Penn State offense at times recently. And I think that these two young players have really changed that dynamic and really kind of changed the attitude of how the offense approaches things.
Went to Nick Singleton again on a 4th and short situation in opposing territory. This time it worked out. It didn't work out last week against Ohio State. And just looking through what Kaytron Allen has done, he brought some momentum into this matchup, added to it in a big way. 5 of the last 6 games, he's gone for at least 86 yards of offense. In the last 2 matchups alone, 5 total touchdowns. He now leads all Nittany Lions with 9 touchdowns in 9 games. And he was the second running back in this class. Let's all recall, really coming up big. And both these guys, we've heard that they're co-starters according to J1 Sider. Back-to-back games now where Katron Allen gets the ball first, and it's actually interesting to see him get a couple series early. It wasn't just Nick Singleton in on the second possession. It was Katron Allen getting a little bit of staying power in that backfield. Before we finish up here, and of course we'll be back with another episode on Monday. Daniel will be back. Mark Brennan will be back in Happy Valley. We'll share our final thoughts on this matchup, start to look ahead to the next one. But Daniel, this defensive line, we went through some of the numbers heading into the matchup, and very much devoid of sack numbers. That changed in a big way today. 6 total sacks, 5 of them, I believe, were credited to this defensive front. And the defensive ends in particular, they rose to the occasion. If they can do this, again, it's hard to know what you're going to be able to carry from this game moving forward because Indiana's in a bad spot right now. But they took advantage of a bad team, and they were able to, if they're able to turn this into a snowball effect moving down, this is the way you want to finish the season defensively, by getting this pressure off the edge. A lot of these guys are going to be with you next year. It's just been a missing link on for a defense that has had some really special moments. It's been a missing link, and I think you got to go back to probably the trip down to Auburn, the last time they were able to mess with a passing pocket like they were today.
And coming into today, Nick Tarbert and Chop Robinson, Adisa Isaac had combined for 3 sacks. They combined for 3 today. I think that this was the type of performance that we were looking for. And I mean, yeah, it comes against an Indiana team that's not in a good spot, but sometimes you need that get right game where there's someone where you can do kind of anything you want to do. You can do what you need to do, and you see it against an opposing team. And that's something that you can really build on. After the game, Chop Robinson said that it was pretty exciting and that they were really feeding off each other, and that there's kind of that friendly competition element when you look at this group in terms of what they want to do. So I think getting those edge rushers and having them be disruptive. And we talked about it a lot where it was always, like Chop Robinson is around the quarterback a lot, and Adisa Isaac is around the quarterback a lot, and they're making things happen. That's different from getting sacks. I mean, a sack is just such an impact play. It's such a psychic play too, and they were finally getting those today. And I think that was pretty big. Also with the sacks, Keziah Izzard and Devon Elise both got on the board. Elise had the hit that knocked out Jack Tuttle from the game. Those are 2 guys who kind of occupy unsung roles in this depth. I know that we've talked about Keziah Izzard a lot in terms of coming back from his absence in September. But Devon Elise is someone who has really just been a solid rotational piece for Penn State. And I think that it was good to see him, get onto the stat sheet and make a big impact. But I thought the defensive line looked really good today. I mean, Brendan Sorsby was just overmatched as a backup quarterback. He got sacked on his first 2 career plays as a true freshman after Tuttle went down. That was just a really, really tough spot for a young player. And I don't necessarily think he was really in the right position to succeed, but Penn State was able to
figure that out quickly because they brought him back to the sideline real fast.
Yeah, that debut did not last long. But I mean, not really anything lasted long for Indiana with the offense today. So, But yeah, it was good to see from the defense. I think that especially how things ended last week, you wanted to see some suffocation. You wanted to see some playmaking with those interceptions. And we got that today. I mean, it was just a very good, they did what they were supposed to do against a bad team that doesn't have a quarterback that is essentially trying to get off the field as much as possible.
Yeah, Indiana fired their offensive line coach this season. So just, that's kind of where they're at right now with their process. And with this defensive group, Denai Dennis Sutton was the guy who came in as the only defensive lineman with multiple sacks on the season through 8 games. He didn't add to that party today, but he came up with an interception, showed off that athleticism on the return. And I think you looked at number 33 rolling his way down the field, and James Franklin said it best, does not look like a freshman. I'm really excited to see where it goes here from Denai Dennis Sutton. And that, that set the stage. We talked about the running backs. You had a guy who we haven't seen much of, Harrison Wallace, a redshirt freshman, reach the end zone on a catch from Drew Aller. Khalil Dinkins got involved here as a redshirt freshman. Dom DeLuca has been a great walk-on story, applied the pressure on that play that denied Dennis Sutton ends up getting the interception on. Later, he recovers a fumble on a punt return by Parker Washington, so a little bit of an unsung hero for him. I've mentioned a bunch of names. One we haven't gotten to, and we got to do it before we finish the podcast, is Jake Pinniger. He hasn't missed a kick in Big Ten play, and today a career-long 50 yards to help build some of that early cushion in the first half.
It was great to see from Pinniger. James Franklin went out of his way during his opening statement to highlight the job that Pinniger did. He hit the 50-yarder. He made all 6 of his extra point attempts, and he kicked all, I think, 7 of his kickoffs for touchbacks. I mean, that's what
against
you want to see.
And they had a lot of respect for the return game on kickoff of Indiana. That was an area they were worried about.
Definitely, James Franklin made sure to point that out. But it was good to see that from Pinniger, especially on a day where the conditions were very dicey. James Franklin did say that the wind was, it did affect things, that it was blowing pretty hard down on the field. When you watched all the kickers, it was almost like it was blowing strong in both directions. And James Evans had that 69-yard punt. Pinniger was putting it beyond the end zone. He was hitting the end line with a bunch of his
Jordan
kickoffs.
Stout, yeah, wow.
Yeah, I mean, it was no doubt, but we talked about it where special teams, that's where you steal points. That's where other teams steal points. Barney Amore early in the season was such a weapon for this defense, and now you're getting consistency from that kickoff spot. And I think that it's something that is probably a little underrated. But when the job isn't being done like it was earlier this year, it's noticeable. So I think for Jake Pinniger to really kind of settle in as that field goal kicker, career long of 50 yards, there was really no doubt about it. And then, to have that success on kickoffs, I think that's really good for Penn State as it moves forward.
It felt like shaky territory, and we still got to see Jake Pinniger make some kicks in close games down the stretch here, I'd imagine. But to this point, he missed a couple field goals, an extra point, all in non-conference action, has not missed any field goals, has not missed any extra points against conference opponents. So not much more you can ask of from your place kicker when he's called out there, that he's putting it through the uprights, and that's all he has done against these Big Ten teams. Daniel, like I said, we're back on Monday. I hope you get home safe from Bloomington. Appreciate your coverage. Catch it all at Lions247.com. Mark Brennan, of course, will have his grades, his takeaways. We have stories about what we saw, what we've heard coming out of this matchup, and we'll have our snap counts and a bunch more coming out of this contest, which was a 45-14 victory. Penn State has some momentum. Maryland suddenly does not. They lost a clunker of a performance. They're 6-3 coming to town. We thought maybe that was a ranked opponent on Penn State's radar. That's not the case. So Penn State, certainly the presumptive favorite for the next 3 games to get to those 10 wins, maybe a big-time bowl matchup, a strong start down that path right now. Daniel, enjoyed your coverage from Bloomington. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Tyler.
All right. Thanks to all of our listeners. I'm Tyler Donohue. This has been the latest post-game edition of the Lions 24/7 podcast.